in the year 1504, an event thousands of miles from America would change everything about how Spain ruled the lands Columbus had discovered just 12 years before. A queen died, and suddenly, control of the New World hung in the balance. Within weeks, Spanish officials began implementing policies so aggressive that indigenous populations would never recover. The transformation happened quietly at first, but by year's end, Spain had established an iron grip over territories stretching from the Caribbean to the coasts of what we now call Florida. This wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and devastating. What started with trade quickly became conquest, and conquest became tyranny. The story of 1504 isn't just about exploration. It's about the moment Spain decided to own an entire hemisphere. The death of Queen Isabella on November 26, 1504, sent shockwaves through the Spanish court. She had been the visionary who funded Columbus's voyages, the monarch who believed in Western expansion when others doubted. With her gone, King Ferdinand inherited her ambitions but lacked her diplomatic restraint. He saw the New World differently than his wife had. Where Isabella imagined trade and conversion, Ferdinand saw wealth extraction and absolute control. The Spanish throne was consolidating power, and the New World would pay the price. By 1504, the reality of what Europeans had found across the Atlantic was becoming clear. The lands weren't the East Indies as Columbus had hoped. They were entirely unknown territories with vast resources, gold, silver, timber, and agricultural potential beyond European imagination. More importantly, millions of people already lived there. The indigenous population, numbering perhaps 50 million across the Americas, had complex societies, established trade routes, and their own forms of government. Spain faced a choice: learn to coexist or conquer. Ferdinand chose conquest. The Spanish government moved with remarkable speed and precision after Isabella's death. Officials created what they called the encomienda system, and this would become the legal framework for Spanish domination. On paper, it sounded reasonable. Spanish settlers received grants of land and were required to protect and convert the indigenous people living there. In reality, it was slavery with a Christian veneer. Thousands of indigenous workers were assigned to Spanish colonists who could demand labor, tribute, and obedience. The system didn't just exploit people, it dismantled indigenous social structures entirely. Ferdinand appointed royal administrators to enforce these new policies with unprecedented strictness. The king understood that without firm control from Spain itself, colonial governors might become independent warlords. He created a hierarchical bureaucracy with Spanish officials overseeing every major decision. Every piece of gold mined, every crop harvested, every indigenous person converted had to be documented and reported back to Spain. Stop this is the moment accounting became weaponized. This wasn't colonization, it was resource extraction disguised as imperialism. What made 1504 particularly significant was timing. Columbus was still alive, aging and confused about what his voyages had actually achieved. His original agreement with Spain guaranteed him a percentage of wealth from the territories he'd discovered. Ferdinand had no intention of honoring that commitment to a man he now saw as an obstacle. By tightening royal control immediately after Isabella's death, Ferdinand sidelined Columbus entirely. The explorer who had opened the hemisphere to European exploitation found himself excluded from the very system that profited from his discoveries. Columbus would die in 1506, largely forgotten and mostly destitute. having made the greatest geographical discovery in human history and received almost nothing in return. The indigenous people of the Caribbean islands and mainland coasts encountered Spanish control with shock and confusion. In 1504, the first generation of Spanish settlers was still a minority, but their authority was backed by superior weaponry and, more devastatingly, by Old World diseases. The Spanish didn't intentionally spread smallpox, plague, and measles, but the effect was genocidal, regardless. Within a decade, 90% of one of the world's most advanced civilizations simply ceased to exist. Within a decade of the encomienda system's implementation, indigenous populations in Hispaniola had fallen by 90%. A society that had thrived for millennia collapsed in less than a generation. The indigenous people had no immunity to European diseases and no understanding of why entire villages were dying. They saw it as spiritual catastrophe. Spanish priests told them their gods had abandoned them, that only conversion to Christianity offered salvation. Desperation made many convert, though whether from genuine belief or survival instinct remains unknowable. What's certain is that Spanish control became absolute precisely when indigenous resistance became impossible. It was brutal timing. The encomienda system accelerated this collapse. As indigenous populations died, Spanish settlers demanded more workers. The system became increasingly harsh, with quotas impossible to meet. Indigenous people were literally worked to death in gold mines and agricultural fields. When they died faster than births could replace them, the system would eventually look across the Atlantic to Africa for slave labor. The transatlantic slave trade, one of history's greatest horrors, grew directly from Spain's inability to enslave indigenous Americans quickly enough. The machinery Ferdinand created in 1504 didn't just destroy American civilizations, it created the demand that launched the African slave trade. What drove Spanish policy in 1504 wasn't simply cruelty or religious fervor, though both played roles. It was gold. Columbus had found small quantities in the streams and rivers of Hispaniola, and that discovery created an obsession in Spain that would reshape world history. Ferdinand believed that vast quantities of precious metals lay somewhere in the New World, waiting to be extracted. He was right. The Aztec and Inca empires possessed wealth in gold that would eventually exceed anything Spain had imagined. The Spanish government structured the entire colonial system around precious metal extraction. The encomienda grants weren't distributed randomly, but concentrated in areas where gold could be found. Royal officials conducted surveys to locate deposits. Entire indigenous nations were redirected from their traditional occupations into forced mining. The economic model was simple and brutal. Transform captured labor into precious metals, ship those metals back to Spain, and use the wealth to finance European power and conquest. By 1504, Spain was already planning for a larger colonial apparatus. Trading posts became permanent settlements. Settlements became regional centers of power. Every resource that couldn't be directly extracted, food, timber, labor, was organized to support the mining operations. The Spanish created a vertically integrated imperial economy 300 years before that term would be invented. Indigenous peoples, their crops, their animals, their knowledge, and their very bodies were all conscripted into service of Spanish wealth accumulation. The gold that flowed back to Spain had consequences Europeans couldn't foresee. The influx of precious metals would eventually cause dramatic inflation across Europe, destabilizing economies and triggering centuries of economic disruption. Spanish gold would finance European wars, royal palaces, and cultural flourishing. It would also spark envy in other European nations, eventually driving a global competition for colonial territories. In 1504, Ferdinand tightened Spanish control to monopolize American wealth. By 1550, every European power wanted a piece of what Spain had claimed. By late 1504, Spanish control had consolidated enough that exploration could resume with official backing. The Caribbean colonies, established in the 1490s, were now producing wealth and demonstrating the viability of the encomienda system. Officials in Spain began planning expeditions deeper into the mainland. They wanted to find the source of the gold, the great civilizations rumored to exist beyond the coasts. A few thousand men would soon topple empires older than Christianity itself. Every expedition had royal oversight. Every promise of land came with obligations to Spain, and every conquistador understood that the throne controlled their authority. This was revolutionary in medieval and Renaissance terms. Previous colonial ventures had been mostly private affairs. Merchants and nobles funded expeditions, kept the profits, and the monarchy extracted taxes. Spain, under Ferdinand, created something different: state-directed imperialism. The king's officials controlled trade policy, labor policy, resource distribution, and military strategy. Individual conquistadors had tremendous personal power, but operated within a royal framework that couldn't be violated. It was colonial bureaucracy before industrial corporations would perfect similar systems. The system's efficiency was terrifying. A small number of Spanish soldiers could control large indigenous populations because Spanish authority was backed by horses, steel weapons, and firearms that indigenous armies couldn't counter. More importantly, the indigenous world was fractured. The Aztec and Inca empires existed, but the lands Spain controlled in 1504 were largely independent nations with no unified resistance structure. By the time larger empires understood the Spanish threat, Spain had already perfected the methods to conquer them. The system that Ferdinand tightened in 1504 would prove devastatingly effective against Montezuma's Aztecs in 1519 and Atahualpa's Incas in 1530. Spanish officials in 1504 couldn't know they were creating the template for a global empire. They were simply implementing the logical extension of their understanding: monarchy, Catholic Christianity, and European superiority. But the machinery they built would expand across oceans and centuries, creating the largest empire in human history at its peak. While Spanish bureaucrats organized their control, indigenous leaders tried to adapt and survive. Some organized armed resistance, launching attacks on Spanish settlements and supply lines. These were almost universally catastrophic failures. An Aztec warrior's obsidian blade was undoubtedly sharper than Spanish steel. It just couldn't change the fundamental advantage steel had over stone. Spanish military technology was overwhelmingly superior, and indigenous armies organized for territorial defense or ceremonial warfare couldn't adapt to Spanish tactics. Yet resistance persisted, even when victory was impossible. Indigenous people fought not because they expected to win, but because surrender meant enslavement and cultural destruction. Other indigenous leaders attempted negotiation and accommodation. They offered tribute, labor, and conversion, hoping to preserve some autonomy within the Spanish system. These leaders became the intermediaries of empire, helping Spain administer control over their own people. Their cooperation made Spanish rule possible with smaller numbers of actual Spanish soldiers. A few thousand Spaniards controlled millions because they had indigenous allies, interpreters, and administrators. It wasn't conquest alone, it was collaboration, born from desperation and the recognition that violent resistance couldn't succeed. The indigenous response, whether resistance or accommodation, demonstrates remarkable sophistication. They understood the threat quickly. They recognized that Spanish authority wouldn't negotiate away the fundamental power imbalance. Indigenous societies had survived invasions, migrations, and internal conflicts for centuries. But Spanish invasion was categorically different. It combined military conquest with epidemiological catastrophe, religious assault, and economic reorganization. No existing indigenous strategy could counter all these threats simultaneously. What makes 1504 crucial is that by this year, the indigenous response had shifted from confusion to adaptation. The initial shock had worn off. Indigenous leaders were now making calculated decisions about how to survive within Spanish rule rather than hoping to expel Spain. That psychological shift, hardened over just 12 years, demonstrated that indigenous peoples understood their circumstances clearly. They weren't conquered because they were naive or unprepared. They were conquered because they faced a technological, military, and microbiological advantage impossible to overcome. The year 1504 marked a hinge in history. The death of Queen Isabella and Ferdinand's consolidation of control over the New World created a blueprint that European powers would follow for the next 4 centuries. Spain didn't invent colonialism. Europeans had already conquered parts of Africa and the Mediterranean. But Spain perfected the colonial system: royal oversight, labor exploitation, religious conversion, resource extraction, and administrative hierarchy. When Britain, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands built their own empires, they copied Spain's model almost exactly. The consequences rippled across centuries. The indigenous populations that survived the initial collapse of 1504 to 1550 were transformed into colonial subjects. Their societies reorganized around Spanish Christianity and European labor systems. Their traditional governments were replaced with Spanish administrators. Their knowledge systems were devalued. Their autonomy was erased. Indigenous peoples didn't disappear. But indigenous civilization, as it had existed, was fundamentally altered. The culture that emerged in Spanish America was a hybrid creation born from conquest and survival. The wealth extracted from the Americas during the centuries following 1504 financed European modernity. The gold and silver that the Spanish extracted through forced labor literally created modern global capitalism. The economic structures, investment patterns, and capital accumulation that would drive the Industrial Revolution originated in American precious metals. Indigenous peoples paid the price in death and enslavement so that Europeans could finance their own transformation into the dominant global civilization. Looking back from 2024, we can see 1504 as the year when Spain's tightening control transformed exploration into systematic conquest. A queen's death and a king's ambition set in motion processes that would reshape the world. Indigenous peoples responded with remarkable resilience and pragmatism, but no amount of adaptation could overcome the fundamental imbalance they faced. The system Ferdinand created was so effective that it became the model for global imperialism. Understanding 1504 means understanding not just American history, but the origins of the modern world itself. This moment 120 years before Jamestown and 116 years before the Pilgrims, created the conditions that would shape North America for the next 5 centuries.